The manila envelope slapped against the mahogany table like a death certificate. I sat there, watching Margaret, my mother-in-law, arrange the life insurance papers with the same precision she used to fold napkins at dinner parties. Her French manicure tapped against the signature line. "Just sign here, Olivia. The house deposit is due Friday." Friday, 3 days from now. 3 days since she'd skipped her own son's funeral to look at waterfront properties. The law office smelled like leather and old money. Rain hammered the floor-to-ceiling windows, each drop sounding like bullets against glass. Margaret's gold bracelet clinked against the conference table as she turned pages, the sound sharp enough to make my teeth ache. $750,000, she said like she was reading a grocery list. "It'll cover the down payment perfectly, with enough left over for renovations. My name is Olivia Morrison. I'm 34 years old, and until last week I thought family meant something. My husband David died when a drunk driver ran a red light on I-94. The impact crushed his car like a soda can. The paramedics said he didn't suffer. His parents couldn't make it to the funeral. They were busy house hunting. Now here sat Margaret dividing up David's life insurance money like we were splitting a restaurant check. Her husband Robert nodded along from his chair, checking his phone every 30 seconds. They'd brought their lawyer, a thin man who kept adjusting his glasses and wouldn't meet my eyes. "This is just temporary," Margaret continued, sliding another document across the table. "Until you get back on your feet. We'll manage the money responsibly." The paper whispered against the wood. Outside, Chicago traffic hummed 20 floors below us, people going about their normal lives, while mine got dissected by lawyers and in-laws who'd shown up for the money, but not the mourning. Margaret leaned forward, her perfume cutting through the leather smell. "David would want his family taken care of. This house has been our dream for 15 years. Our dream. Not David's dream. Theirs. But sitting in that sterile conference room, watching Margaret carve up my husband's death benefits like Sunday roast, I realized she'd made one crucial mistake. She had no idea what David had whispered to me the night before the accident, when he thought I was sleeping. She didn't know about the envelope he'd hidden in his desk drawer, or the phone call he'd made to his insurance company just 2 weeks ago. Margaret thought she was stealing from a grieving widow. She was about to discover she'd been hunting a woman who knew exactly what her dead husband thought of his parents' dreams. Let me back up and tell you how I got here, sitting across from 2 people who'd raised the man I loved but couldn't find time to bury him. David and I met 6 years ago during my nursing clinicals at Northwestern Memorial. I was exhausted, 3 months into pediatric rotations, when this resident appeared with a tray of coffee for the night shift. Dark hair falling into his eyes, scrubs that had seen better days, but he had this smile that made you forget you'd been on your feet for 12 hours straight. "You look like you could use this more than I could," he said, handing me a cup. "Extra sugar, trust me." We ended up talking until 6 in the morning in the hospital cafeteria, surrounded by the smell of industrial coffee and disinfected. He told me about why he'd chosen pediatrics, how he'd been sick as a kid and remembered the nurses who made him feel brave. I told him about my family in California, how my Korean grandmother had taught me that healing was about more than medicine. Neither of us mentioned that we were both supposed to be sleeping. David was finishing his pediatric residency, pulling 80-hour weeks that should have been illegal, but somehow he always found time to check on the night shift nurses, bringing coffee or just asking how we were holding up. The other residents barely acknowledged we existed. Our first real date was at a 24-hour diner after we'd both worked back-to-back doubles. I was so tired I could barely keep my eyes open, but David kept me laughing until the sunrise painted the Chicago skyline pink through the windows. "I want to do more than just treat sick kids," he said, stirring cream into his 4th cup of coffee. "I want to fix the system that makes them sick in the first place." That's when I knew I was falling in love with him. Not because he was handsome, though he was, but because he saw the world the way I did, like something that could be better if you just cared enough to try. We got married 2 years later in a simple ceremony at my family's church in San Francisco. David's parents flew in from Chicago, and I remember thinking how different our families were. Mine crowded around David, teaching him Korean phrases and insisting he call my grandmother Halmoni. Margaret and Robert stood apart, polite but distant, like they were attending a business function rather than their son's wedding. "She's lovely," Margaret told David at the reception, her voice carrying just far enough for me to hear. "But are you sure about this? Marriage is such a big step." Their son was 30 years old, a doctor, but apparently still needed his mother's approval to get married. The red flags were there from the beginning, bright as traffic cones, but I convinced myself they just needed time to warm up to me. Margaret's comments about me not being right for David, Robert's uncomfortable silence whenever I mentioned my family's traditions, the way they'd call David directly when they needed something, like I was just his roommate instead of his wife. When David got into the pediatric oncology fellowship at Children's Hospital, his parents were furious. The salary was $60,000 less than what he could make in private practice, $60,000 less than what they'd been counting on. "You're wasting your education," Robert said during one of their weekly phone calls. David had it on speaker while he cooked dinner, not realizing I could hear every word. "All those years of medical school, all that debt, and you want to work for peanuts? It's not about the money, Dad. Everything is about money when you don't have any." Margaret's voice cut through the static. "Olivia's pushing him toward this charity nonsense. She doesn't understand what it takes to build a real life." I stood in our kitchen doorway, wooden spoon in my hand, listening to my mother-in-law blame me for my husband's compassion. David turned off the speaker and took the call into the bedroom. When he came out 20 minutes later, his face was tight with frustration. "They'll come around," he said, but his voice didn't sound convinced. They didn't come around. They got worse. When David's fellowship began, I postponed my nurse practitioner program to support us through the income reduction. I picked up extra shifts, worked weekends, covered nights when other nurses called in sick. Margaret never acknowledged these sacrifices. Instead, she'd send David articles about lucrative positions in private practice, always with little notes attached, just thinking about your future. The 2009 financial crisis hit Robert's construction business hard. Contracts dried up, payments were delayed, and suddenly they were facing foreclosure on their house. David didn't hesitate. We emptied our savings account, $15,000 we'd been keeping for a down payment on our own place, and wired it to their mortgage company. "Family first," David said, but I could see the worry in his eyes. We'd been planning to buy a condo, start thinking about kids. Now we were back to square one financially. Margaret's thank you call lasted exactly 3 minutes. No acknowledgement of whose paychecks had funded their rescue, no recognition that we'd sacrificed our own plans for their stability. Just a brisk expression of gratitude and a quick transition to complaining about their insurance premiums. When we got engaged, they missed our engagement party. "Prior commitments," Margaret said, but my cousin later mentioned seeing them at a golf tournament that same weekend. When we planned our wedding, Margaret questioned every decision. The venue was too expensive, the guest list too large, the flowers too elaborate. But when her real estate business struggled and she couldn't contribute to the costs, we covered those too. I worked double shifts for 3 months to pay for their hotel rooms, their flights, the rehearsal dinner they insisted on hosting but couldn't afford. "She's very generous," Margaret told my mother at the reception, her tone suggesting this was somehow a character flaw. The worst part was watching David try to bridge the gap between us. He'd defend me to his parents, then make excuses for them to me. He was caught in the middle of a war he'd never signed up for, trying to keep peace between the woman he'd chosen and the people who'd raised him. "They're just protective," he'd say after particularly difficult dinners. "They want what's best for me." "What they want is control," I'd reply, but I tried to keep the bitterness out of my voice. I thought I was building something with David's family. I thought my dedication, my sacrifices, my willingness to put their needs ahead of my own plans would eventually earn their acceptance. I thought love was something you could prove through service. I was about to discover that Margaret saw it as weakness she could exploit. Last Christmas, when David announced his dream of opening a free clinic in an underserved neighborhood, Margaret's mask finally slipped completely. "You can't be serious," she said, setting down her wine glass hard enough to make the table shake. "You're 33 years old, David. When are you going to start thinking about your real responsibilities?" "What real responsibilities?" David asked. "Your family, your future, the people who invested everything in your education." Her eyes cut to me. "Some of us have been planning for retirement, expecting our children to help when the time comes." The expectation hung in the air like smoke. David's success wasn't just his. It was theirs, too. They'd invested in his medical degree the way other people invested in stocks, expecting returns. That night, David was quiet for hours. We lay in bed listening to the snow hit our bedroom window, and I could feel him thinking. "She's wrong," he finally said. "About the clinic, about what I owe them, about you." "David?" "No, Olivia, she's wrong. They raised me to be independent, to make my own decisions. But every time I make a choice that doesn't benefit them directly, suddenly I'm selfish." He rolled over to face me in the dark. "I want to build something meaningful, something that helps people who can't help themselves. If that's not what they want from me, then that's their problem." I thought that conversation was the end of our struggle with his parents. I thought David had finally chosen our future over their expectations. I didn't realize it was just the beginning of Margaret's plan to make sure their dreams came first, no matter what it cost us. The call came at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in March. I remember the exact time because I was staring at the clock waiting for David to come home from his shift at Children's Hospital. He'd texted me at midnight saying he was finishing up paperwork and would be home soon. Instead, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Is this Olivia Morrison, wife of Dr. David Morrison?" The voice was professional, detached. A police officer, I realized, my stomach dropping like an elevator with cut cables. "There's been an accident on Interstate 94. Your husband was involved in a collision with a drunk driver. I need you to come to Northwestern Memorial immediately." My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. "Is he hurt? How badly is he hurt?" The pause lasted forever. "Ma'am, I think it's better if we discuss this in person." I knew before I got to the hospital. You always know. David had been driving home on 94 when a drunk driver ran a red light at the Ashland exit. The impact crushed the driver's side of his Honda completely. The emergency room doctor, a woman about my age with kind eyes, told me he wouldn't have suffered. The damage was too severe, too instant. I called Margaret and Robert from the hospital family room, my fingers numb as I dialed their number. Margaret answered on the first ring, like she'd been awake. "Margaret, there's been an accident." My voice sounded like it was coming from someone else's throat. "David's gone." The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then Margaret's voice, sharp and focused. "We'll handle the arrangements. Don't do anything until we get there." Not, "How are you?" Not, "What happened?" Not even, "Are you sure?" Just immediate assumption of control. They arrived at Northwestern Memorial within an hour, which was impressive considering they lived in Naperville, 90 minutes away in good traffic. But instead of offering comfort, instead of asking how I was holding up, Margaret immediately began making decisions. She walked into the family room like she owned the place, her purse clutched tight against her chest, Robert trailing behind her like a shadow. Her handshake was ice cold when she took my hands. "Have you signed any paperwork?" were her first words to me. "What?" "Release forms, arrangements. Have you committed to anything yet?" I stared at her. My husband had been dead for 4 hours, and she was worried about paperwork. "The funeral home on Maple Street is where Robert's family has always gone," she announced, already pulling out her phone. "I'll call them first thing in the morning." "Margaret, I think we should discuss—" "You're in shock, dear. Let us handle the details." She physically positioned herself between me and the doctor when he came to explain what would happen next. When the chaplain arrived to offer spiritual support, Margaret intercepted him like a bodyguard protecting a client. "She's fine," Margaret told him. "We're taking care of her." But they weren't taking care of me. They were taking care of the situation. Robert cleared his throat every time I tried to speak, this uncomfortable sound that somehow managed to cut off whatever I was saying. Margaret's phone buzzed constantly with text messages that she'd checked mid-conversation, her attention divided between my grief and whatever business she was conducting. "We'll need to contact the insurance company," she said, scrolling through her phone, "and the bank. David had several accounts we'll need to sort through." The bank. The insurance company. David had been dead for 6 hours, and Margaret was already thinking about his money. Over the next 3 days, as we planned David's funeral, Margaret's control became absolute. She chose the casket, selected the flowers, wrote the obituary. When I suggested including a mention of David's dream to open a free clinic, she edited it out. Let's focus on his medical achievements. People don't need to hear about his hobby projects. Hobby projects. That's what she called the work that had made David's eyes light up when he talked about it. But what Margaret did during those funeral planning days revealed a level of calculation I'd never imagined, and a secret she'd been keeping for months. I found out by accident. Margaret had left her purse open on my kitchen counter while she was using the bathroom, and her phone screen lit up with a text notification. I wasn't trying to snoop, but the message was right there in plain view. House still available. Seller motivated. Need to move fast if you want it. The message was from someone named Linda Chen, and it was time-stamped from 2 days before David died. Margaret had been actively house hunting while David was still alive. While we were struggling with his fellowship salary, while she was complaining about his career choices, she was shopping for retirement properties. When she came back from the bathroom, I asked her about it. "Oh, that," she said, closing her purse with a snap. "We've been casually looking for a few months, nothing serious." Nothing serious. But she'd been texting with real estate agents while planning her son's funeral. 2 days before the service, Margaret surprised me by showing up at my apartment with photo albums of David's childhood. For the first time since the accident, she seemed genuinely emotional. "I wanted to share these with you," she said, settling onto my couch with a stack of albums. "David would want you to have them." We spent 2 hours looking through pictures. David as a toddler, gap-toothed and grinning. David in his Little League uniform. David at his high school graduation, his arm around both his parents. "He talked about you constantly after you started dating," Margaret said, tears in her eyes. "Even when he was little, he'd say he wanted to marry someone who cared about helping people. I guess I was just scared of losing him." Her voice broke on those last words, and for the first time since I'd known her, Margaret seemed genuinely vulnerable. "I know I haven't always been welcoming, but David loved you so much. He was happier with you than I'd ever seen him." We hugged for the first time since David and I had gotten engaged. I thought we'd finally found common ground in our grief. I thought his death had somehow brought us together. I was wrong. The funeral was scheduled for 2 p.m. on Saturday at St. Mary's Catholic Church, where David and I had been married. By 1:45, I stood alone at the front of the church, greeting the dozens of colleagues, friends, and family members who'd come to say goodbye. My parents had flown in from California, David's medical school classmates, nurses from the hospital, former patients' families. The church was packed with people whose lives David had touched. But the front row, reserved for immediate family, had 2 empty seats. At 1:50, my phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. "Emergency with the Riverside property. Can't make it today. We'll visit the grave later this week." The Riverside property. I knew exactly what that meant. The lakefront house they'd been trying to buy for 3 years, their dream retirement home. They'd chosen a real estate showing over their son's funeral. I stared at that text message, surrounded by 200 people who'd loved David enough to rearrange their Saturday to honor his memory, and felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest. The funeral proceeded without them. David's Uncle Thomas gave a eulogy about David's commitment to helping sick children. My father spoke about how David had embraced our family traditions. The hospital chaplain read from David's favorite psalm. The empty seats in the front row seemed to glow like neon signs. But what came next was worse than their absence. During the burial service, while I stood at David's graveside amid a handful of dirt, my phone kept buzzing with social media notifications. I ignored them at first, but my sister eventually pulled me aside. "Olivia, you need to see this." She showed me Margaret's Facebook page, posted 30 minutes earlier, during the funeral service, a photo album titled House Hunting Adventures. Margaret and Robert stood in a beautiful lakefront living room, champagne glasses raised, huge smiles on their faces. The timestamp showed the photos had been taken at 2:15 p.m., 15 minutes after David's funeral had started. Robert had checked in at an expensive steakhouse at 3:30 p.m., right when we were lowering David's casket into the ground. His status update read, "Celebrating new beginnings. Life is good." But the worst was Margaret's Instagram story from that evening. A close-up shot of 2 champagne flutes, expensive-looking bubbles catching the light. The caption read, "Dreams coming true at the perfect time." Posted at 6:47 p.m., 2 hours after we'd buried her son. I showed the post to my parents, to David's medical school friends, to anyone who'd listen. Their faces went through the same progression of disbelief, shock, and disgust. "They didn't come to the funeral?" David's cousin Marcus asked, staring at the photos. "They were house hunting while we were burying David?" The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Not just missing the funeral, but celebrating while it happened, documenting their celebration, sharing their joy with the world while their son's friends and colleagues mourned his death. But the worst revelation came after most people had left the cemetery. David's Uncle Thomas approached me in the parking lot, his face grim with something that looked like guilt. "Olivia, I need to tell you something I probably should have mentioned years ago." Thomas had been Robert's younger brother, but they'd had a falling out over business dealings in the 1990s. He'd maintained a relationship with David despite the family tension. "Margaret called me 3 weeks ago," Thomas said, looking uncomfortable. "She wanted to know about David's life insurance policy, asked if I knew how much coverage he had through the hospital." 3 weeks ago? Before the accident? She said she was just curious about whether David was financially responsible now that he was married. But she kept pushing for specifics, dollar amounts, beneficiary information. My stomach dropped. "What did you tell her?" "Nothing. I told her it wasn't my business. But Olivia..." Thomas hesitated, then pulled out his phone. "There's something you need to know about that insurance policy, something Margaret doesn't want you to find out." He showed me a text message conversation from his phone, messages between him and David from just 2 weeks before the accident. "David, Uncle Thomas, I need some advice about insurance and family stuff." Thomas, "What kind of advice?" David, "If something happened to me, would my parents have any claim on my life insurance policy, even if Olivia is the sole beneficiary?" Thomas, "Not unless you name them specifically." "Why are you asking?" David, "Mom's been asking weird questions about money lately, about my salary, my benefits, my financial responsibilities. I'm worried she thinks I owe them something." Thomas, "Your money is your business, David. You don't owe anyone anything." David, "I know, but I want to make sure Olivia is protected if anything happens. She sacrificed so much for my career. I don't want my parents interfering with her future." I read those messages 3 times, my hands shaking. David had been worried about his parents' financial expectations, worried enough to research beneficiary rights just 2 weeks before he died. "There's more," Thomas said quietly. "Margaret called me yesterday, asked if I'd help convince you to share the insurance money with the family, said it was the right thing to do since Robert and Margaret had invested so much in David's education." The parking lot around us had emptied. The funeral home staff were loading flowers into their van. David's grave was covered with fresh dirt and arrangements that would wilt in the spring sun. And his parents, the people who'd raised him and claimed to love him, were already calculating how to profit from his death. "They planned this," I whispered, the pieces finally clicking into place. "They knew about the insurance policy. They'd been planning this for weeks, maybe months. They'd been waiting for David to die so they could claim his insurance money." The woman who'd hugged me and shared photo albums, who'd cried about losing her son, had been performing, manipulating my grief while calculating how to steal my future. But as Thomas and I stood there, in the growing dusk, I realized something else. Margaret had made a crucial mistake. She thought she was dealing with a broken, grieving widow who'd be easy to manipulate. She had no idea that David had told me everything about his parents' financial expectations. She didn't know about the envelope he had hidden in our apartment or the phone calls he'd made to his insurance company. She didn't know that her son had seen this coming and prepared for it. Margaret thought she was hunting easy prey. She was about to discover she'd cornered a woman who knew exactly how dangerous she was. Margaret called me at 8:30 a.m. on Monday morning, not to ask how I was doing, not to apologize for missing her son's funeral, not even to explain why she'd been celebrating with champagne while we lowered David into the ground. She called to discuss money. "Olivia, we need to meet about David's finances," she said, her voice brisk and businesslike. "There are decisions that need to be made quickly." I was sitting in David's apartment, our apartment, surrounded by sympathy flowers that were already starting to wilt. The kitchen counter was covered with casserole dishes from neighbors, food I couldn't bring myself to eat. David's coffee mug still sat in the sink, unwashed, because cleaning it felt like erasing him. What kind of decisions? The life insurance needs to be processed. There are deadlines, paperwork to file, estate issues to settle. Margaret's voice carried the same tone she used when discussing closing costs with her real estate clients. Estate issues. 3 days after burying her son, and Margaret was talking about estate issues? "I haven't even thought about insurance yet," I said, watching a cardinal land on our fire escape. David always loved watching birds from our kitchen window. "Well, you need to think about it now. These things don't handle themselves." Something cold crept into my chest. "Margaret, can we talk about this later? I'm still processing." "Processing doesn't pay bills, Olivia. David's gone, but life continues. We have responsibilities." Responsibilities? Like the house deposit that was due Friday. They insisted we meet at their attorney's office on Wednesday, which should have been my first warning. Margaret gave me an address in downtown Chicago, a law firm I'd never heard of. When I asked why we couldn't just talk at their house, she said it would be more professional to handle estate matters in a formal setting. I should have brought my own lawyer. I should have questioned why they had legal representation when I didn't. I should have wondered how they'd managed to schedule an appointment so quickly with an attorney they supposedly hadn't consulted before. But I was still operating under the assumption that we were family, that they had my best interests at heart along with their own. I was wrong. The law office was in one of those glass towers that line the Chicago River, all marble lobbies and hushed voices. Margaret and Robert were already there when I arrived, sitting across from a thin man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as William Hartley. "Mrs. Morrison," Hartley said, standing to shake my hand. "I am very sorry for your loss. Your in-laws have asked me to help streamline David's estate settlement." Streamline. That word again. The conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river. Under different circumstances, I might have found it beautiful. Instead, it felt like a fishbowl, like I was being observed and studied. Margaret and Robert sat on one side of the polished table. I sat alone on the other. The seating arrangement should have told me everything I needed to know about what was coming. "This is really just a formality," Margaret said, sliding a stack of documents toward me. David would have wanted his estate handled efficiently, without a lot of legal complications. The papers were neatly organized in manila folders, labeled with official-looking tabs. Someone had put a lot of work into preparing them, more work than you could do in 3 days. I opened the first folder and started reading. The language was dense, full of legal terminology I didn't understand, but the basic concept was clear enough. The documents transferred all of David's life insurance benefits, $750,000, into a joint trust account controlled by Margaret and Robert. I would receive what the papers called a reasonable monthly allowance for living expenses, defined as $2,000 per month, until I remarried or died. $2,000 from a $750,000 policy? "I don't understand," I said, looking up from the papers. "Why would I need an allowance for my own husband's insurance money?" Hartley cleared his throat. "Mrs. Morrison, the trust structure protects the principal while ensuring your needs are met. It's actually quite generous." Generous. $2,000 a month while Margaret and Robert use the remaining money to buy their dream house? "This doesn't seem right," I said, my voice barely steady. David named me as the sole beneficiary. I have our copy of the policy at home." Margaret's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. Beneficiary designations can be complicated when there are family considerations. David's father and I invested heavily in his education, his career development. We have legitimate interests in his estate. Legitimate interests? In my husband's death benefits? "I need time to think about this," I said, pushing the papers back across the table. Margaret's controlled mask slipped for just a moment. Her voice sharpened. "Time is a luxury we don't have, Olivia. The house deposit is due this week, and the sellers won't wait. If we lose this property, we'll have to start the search all over again." The house deposit. She wasn't even pretending this wasn't about their real estate purchase. Robert spoke for the first time since I had arrived. "We're not getting any older, Olivia. This might be our last chance to buy the retirement home we've been dreaming about." Their last chance, built on their son's death. "David just died on Sunday. It's Wednesday. You want me to sign away his insurance money so you can buy a house?" "We want you to be practical, Olivia. David's gone, but life continues. We have responsibilities. Something positive, like a lakefront view and a gourmet kitchen?" Hartley interrupted before I could respond. "Perhaps Mrs. Morrison needs time to review the documents with her own counsel." Margaret's eyes snapped at him. "That won't be necessary. This is a family matter." But I was already standing up, gathering my purse. "I'll call you when I've decided." "Olivia," Margaret's voice followed me to the door. "Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." I left without answering. That night, I sat in David's home office, surrounded by his medical journals and the framed photo from our wedding day. The apartment felt too quiet, too empty, like the silence had weight and mass. Margaret's words kept echoing in my mind. David would have wanted his estate handled efficiently. David would have been disgusted. My husband had spent his entire adult life trying to help people who couldn't help themselves. He'd chosen pediatric oncology over lucrative private practice because he wanted to make a difference, not money. He dreamed of opening a free clinic in an underserved neighborhood, using his skills to treat kids whose families couldn't afford health care. And his parents wanted to use his death benefits to buy a retirement home. The grief didn't disappear, but something else emerged alongside it. Something cold and clear and utterly focused. David had trusted me with his dreams, his hopes, his legacy. He'd spent 6 years showing me what it meant to put other people's needs ahead of your own comfort. I wasn't going to let his parents steal that legacy to fund their lakefront fantasies. I pulled out the folder David kept in his desk drawer, the one labeled Important Documents. Our marriage certificate was there, along with copies of our wills and our joint bank account information. But underneath those familiar papers was something I'd never seen before. A letter in David's careful handwriting, dated just 2 weeks before the accident. The header read, "Modification of Beneficiary Designation, Northwestern Memorial Life Insurance Policy." My hands were shaking as I read. "To whom it may concern, I am writing to formally request a modification of my life insurance beneficiary designation. Recent conversations with my parents have raised concerns about their expectations regarding my financial obligations to them after establishing my own household. While I love my parents and appreciate their support during my education, I'm concerned that they view my insurance policy as a family asset rather than protection for my wife's future security. My mother has made several inquiries about my policy details, asking about coverage amounts and beneficiary structures. When I explained that my wife Olivia is the sole beneficiary, she expressed displeasure and suggested that family money should stay with family. I want to be clear that my life insurance policy is intended solely for my wife's protection and security. Should anything happen to me, Olivia should have complete control over these funds to pursue her own goals and dreams, including the free clinic we have discussed opening together. I'm requesting that additional language be added to my beneficiary designation, explicitly stating that no other party has any claim to these benefits, regardless of family relationship or financial contribution to my education. My parents are financially stable and do not require support from my insurance policy. My wife, however, has sacrificed her own career advancement to support my medical training and should be protected if I am no longer able to provide for her. Please contact me to discuss the necessary paperwork for this modification. Sincerely, Dr. David Morrison. I read that letter 3 times, tears blurring my vision. David had known. He'd seen exactly what his parents were capable of, and he'd tried to protect me. The letter was never sent. I found it still sealed in an envelope with stamps attached, sitting in David's desk drawer, like he'd been interrupted before mailing it. But it proved everything. David's intentions, his concerns about his parents, his understanding that they saw his success and his death as opportunities for their own gain. Margaret thought she was manipulating a grief-stricken widow who didn't know her legal rights. She had no idea that her son had documented her behavior and prepared evidence that would destroy her plans completely. That letter David had written changed everything I thought I knew about his relationship with his parents. But more than that, it showed me that David had been protecting me even when he couldn't protect himself. It was about to become the key to destroying their plans completely. Sitting in David's office, holding proof of his love and foresight, I felt something shift inside me. The paralyzing grief began to crystallize into something harder, something more useful. Margaret wanted to play games with my husband's legacy? Fine, but she was about to discover that David had taught me everything I needed to know about fighting for what is right, even when the odds seem impossible, especially then. The next 3 days became a crash course in insurance law, estate planning, and predatory family dynamics. I barely slept, barely ate, just researched everything I could find about beneficiary rights and inheritance fraud. David's letter had given me the foundation, but I needed to understand exactly what Margaret was trying to do and how to stop her. The original life insurance policy was clear. I was the sole beneficiary. Margaret and Robert were listed only as contingent beneficiaries if I died before David. There was no ambiguity, no gray area for interpretation. The money was legally mine, period. But Margaret's documents were attempting to override David's explicit wishes through what I now understood was legal manipulation designed to exploit my grief and inexperience. Her attorney's papers created something called a family estate trust, claiming that David's parents had significant financial interest in his earning potential due to their investment in his education. The language was sophisticated, designed to sound official and intimidating. It was also complete nonsense. Parents don't get equity stakes in their children's future earnings just because they paid for college. Medical school loans don't create permanent debt to your family. And life insurance beneficiaries can't be changed after death through paperwork manipulation. Margaret was counting on me not knowing any of this. Uncle Thomas called me Thursday evening while I was surrounded by printouts of insurance regulations and estate law websites. "Olivia, I need to tell you something about Margaret and Robert," he said, his voice careful. "Something I probably should have mentioned years ago." Thomas had been Robert's younger brother, but they'd had a falling out in the late 90s over some business dealings. He'd maintained a relationship with David despite the family tension, serving as the uncle who could offer perspective without taking sides. "They've been in serious financial trouble for months," Thomas revealed. "Robert's construction company owes nearly $80,000 in back taxes. Margaret's real estate business has dried up since the market shifted. They've been living on credit cards and prayer." This explained so much. The urgent timeline for the house purchase, Margaret's focus on handling David's finances immediately after his death, the prepared legal documents that must have taken weeks to draft. How do you know all this? Because I've been documenting it, Thomas said grimly. I suspected something like this might happen after David died. Margaret's been making comments about David's financial responsibilities to the family for months. I started keeping records. Thomas had been more thorough than I had expected. Over the next hour, he emailed me files that painted a devastating picture of Margaret and Robert's financial situation. Bank statements showing maxed-out credit cards on 5 different accounts, tax liens filed against Robert's construction business by both the state and federal government, documentation of a second mortgage on their current home taken out 6 months ago when Margaret's real estate commissions disappeared. But the most damning evidence was email correspondence between Margaret and her real estate agent dating back to before David's accident. We'll have access to additional funds soon. My son's life insurance policy should cover the full purchase price, plus renovations. The email was dated 3 weeks before David died. Margaret hadn't just planned to exploit his death, she'd been counting on it. There's more, Thomas said when I called him back after reading everything. Margaret's been telling people that you're not equipped to handle large sums of money. She's been positioning herself as the responsible family member who needs to protect David's legacy from your poor judgment. My poor judgment. The woman who'd managed our household finances for 6 years, who'd worked extra shifts to support David's fellowship, who'd sacrificed my own career advancement to build our life together. But Margaret's narrative was spreading. Thomas showed me Facebook posts where she'd asked for prayers for family members struggling with financial decisions during grief. Subtle comments about young widows who don't understand complex estate matters. She was building a public case for her trustworthiness while undermining my competence. The worst part is how she's been celebrating, Thomas continued. Her social media posts during David's funeral were bad enough, but she's gotten worse since then. He was right. Margaret's Facebook had become a chronicle of anticipatory victory, photos of luxury home listings with captions like, "Dreams coming true," posts about exciting new chapters, and sometimes you have to fight for what's right. 2 weeks after her son's funeral. While I was researching Margaret's social media campaign, she was escalating her pressure on me directly. She called twice daily about the delay in processing David's insurance claim. When I stopped answering her calls, she started showing up at my apartment unannounced. "Olivia, we need to discuss this reasonably," she said, standing in my doorway with Robert lurking behind her. "Every day we wait costs us money. The sellers are getting impatient." The sellers, not David's nunnery, not family healing, not proper estate handling. The sellers of the house she wanted to buy with her dead son's money. "I'm still reviewing the documents," I told her. "What's to review? It's straightforward. David's gone, the money needs to be managed responsibly, and we're the logical choice to handle it." Logical choice, because a woman who'd skipped her son's funeral was obviously the responsible decision-maker. But Margaret's arrogance was actually helping me. Every pushy phone call, every uninvited visit, every social media celebration was building evidence of her true priorities. Thomas had one more crucial piece of information for me. "I think you should talk to Jennifer Walsh. She was David's roommate in law school, and she specializes in estate disputes now. She knows exactly what Margaret is trying to do." Jennifer agreed to meet me at a coffee shop near Northwestern Memorial, neutral territory where we couldn't be overheard. She was about my age with sharp eyes and the kind of presence that suggested she didn't lose cases often. "I heard about David," she said, settling into the booth across from me. "I'm so sorry. He was one of the good ones." I showed her Margaret's documents and David's unsent letter. Jennifer read everything carefully, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. "Your mother-in-law's attorney is either incompetent or deliberately deceptive. These documents have no legal standing. David's beneficiary designation is ironclad." "Then why go through all this trouble?" "Because they're hoping you don't know that. They're betting on your grief and inexperience to make you sign away your rights voluntarily." Jennifer explained the legal reality. Life insurance beneficiaries can't be changed after death. Parents have no automatic claim on their adult children's assets, and attempting to defraud insurance beneficiaries through false documentation is a federal crime. The problem is proving their intent.
We need to document that they knew David's wishes and deliberately tried to subvert them."
That's where Thomas's evidence became crucial. The emails about accessing David's insurance money before his death, the financial records showing their desperate need for cash, the social media posts celebrating during his funeral. "This isn't just inheritance fraud," Jennifer said, studying the timeline Thomas had created. "This is conspiracy to commit fraud, possibly criminal conspiracy, depending on how long they've been planning it." But Jennifer warned me about the risks of fighting back. If Margaret realizes we're building a case against her, she might accelerate her timeline. She could try to file fraudulent claims directly with the insurance company, or even contest David's mental competency when he wrote that letter. The mental competency angle was particularly dangerous. If Margaret could convince a court that David was mentally unstable when he wrote about protecting me from his parents' financial expectations, she might be able to argue that his concerns were delusional. "We need to move carefully," Jennifer advised. "Build an overwhelming case before we reveal our hand." Over the next week, we developed a comprehensive strategy. Thomas continued documenting Margaret and Robert's financial situation and public statements. I gathered evidence of their absence from David's funeral and their immediate focus on his insurance money. Jennifer researched legal precedents and prepared formal complaints to file with both the insurance company and state authorities. But our plan faced a serious complication when Thomas called me with disturbing news. "Olivia, I found something else, something that changes everything." Thomas had been investigating Margaret's real estate connections, trying to understand how she'd managed to schedule attorney appointments and draft legal documents so quickly after David's death. What he discovered was worse than we'd imagined. Margaret's been working with William Hartley, that attorney, for over 2 months, Thomas said. "I found billing records from his office. She's been paying him to research inheritance law and beneficiary challenges since January. Since January, 2 months before David died. There's more. Margaret took out a loan against her real estate license, using anticipated commissions as collateral. The loan documents specifically mention family estate settlement as the expected income source." Margaret hadn't just been planning to exploit David's death, she'd been financing those plans with borrowed money, counting on his life insurance to cover her debts. The loan is due next month. If she doesn't pay it back, she loses her real estate license and faces bankruptcy. She's not just greedy, Olivia, she's desperate. Our plan was solid, but Thomas's discovery revealed that Margaret had been planning this for longer than we thought. She had legal counsel we hadn't known about, financial pressures that made her dangerous, and allies who'd been helping her develop strategies to steal David's insurance money. We weren't just fighting a greedy mother-in-law anymore. We were up against a coordinated conspiracy that had been months in the making. Margaret thought she'd cornered a grieving widow who didn't know her rights, but she'd actually trapped herself in a web of fraud so extensive that when we finally struck back, it would destroy not just her plans, but her entire life. The evidence we'd gathered wasn't just enough to protect David's insurance money. It was enough to put Margaret and her lawyer in prison. She just didn't know it yet. I scheduled the meeting for the following Tuesday at 2 p.m., using the same conference room where Margaret had first tried to steal David's insurance money. The symmetry felt appropriate. "I've made my decision about the trust documents," I told Margaret over the phone. "I think we should meet to discuss the details." Margaret's relief was audible. "I knew you'd come around. David would be so proud of how maturely you're handling this." David would be proud, but not for the reasons she thought. I arrived first, taking the seat at the head of the conference table instead of the subordinate position Margaret had assigned me during our previous meeting. Jennifer sat beside me, her briefcase filled with evidence that would destroy Margaret's plans completely. When Margaret and Robert arrived with William Hartley, their confidence was palpable. Margaret wore her best suit, the one she saved for closing million-dollar real estate deals. Robert carried a bottle of champagne, presumably to celebrate finalizing their fraud. Olivia, I'm so glad you've decided to be reasonable about this, Margaret said, settling into her chair with a satisfied smile. Family should stick together during difficult times. That's exactly why I brought my own attorney, I replied, gesturing to Jennifer, to make sure we handle this properly. Margaret's smile faltered. I don't understand why you need a lawyer. This is family business. Family business is exactly why I need one, I said, pulling David's letter from my briefcase. I found this in his desk. The manila envelope hit the table with a sound that seemed to echo through the room. Margaret's face went pale as she recognized David's handwriting on the envelope. I read his words aloud, my voice steady and clear. I am deeply concerned about my parents' expectation that my life insurance policy should fund their personal expenses rather than provide security for Olivia. Recent conversations with my parents have raised concerns about their view of my insurance as a family asset rather than protection for Olivia's future. Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. That's not. David was confused about our intentions. Was he confused when you asked him about his policy coverage amounts? Was he confused when you suggested that family money should stay with family? Hartley leaned forward, trying to regain control of the situation. Mrs. Morrison, personal letters don't override established estate law. Our documents are still legally valid. Jennifer spoke for the first time, her voice cutting through Hartley's bluster like a scalpel. Actually, Mr. Hartley, your documents aren't legally valid at all. They're fraudulent attempts to circumvent a clear beneficiary designation. She slid a folder across the table to him. This is a copy of the original life insurance policy. Mrs. Morrison is the sole beneficiary. There's no ambiguity, no family trust provision, and no legal basis for your fabricated documents. Hartley opened the folder, his face growing paler with each page. These weren't the doctored versions he'd helped Margaret create. These were the genuine policy documents from David's insurance company. Robert's composure cracked first. David never understood business, he blurted out. He was throwing away his earning potential on charity work while we were losing our house. We invested everything in his education. We deserved some return on that investment. So you decided his death was your business opportunity? Jennifer asked quietly, her pen moving across her legal pad. The room went silent, except for the scratch of Jennifer documenting Robert's confession. Margaret shot her husband a look that could have melted steel. But the damage was done. Robert had just admitted they viewed David's death as a financial opportunity. That's not what he meant. We loved David. Everything we did was for his own good. Like skipping his funeral to look at houses? I asked. Margaret's face flushed red. That was an emergency. The property was only available that day. An emergency that was more important than saying goodbye to your son? At that moment, Thomas knocked on the conference room door. Margaret turned to see who was interrupting, and her face went white. Uncle Thomas? She said weakly. What are you doing here? Thomas entered carrying a banker's box that looked like it weighed 50 pounds. Bringing evidence, he said simply. He began pulling out documents and spreading them across the table. Bank statements showing Margaret and Robert's maxed out credit cards, tax liens against Robert's business, email correspondence between Margaret and her real estate agent. This email is particularly interesting, Thomas said, holding up a printout. Margaret wrote to her agent 3 weeks before David died. We'll have access to additional funds soon. My son's life insurance policy should cover the full purchase price plus renovations. Hartley stared at the email, his professional composure completely shattered. Mrs. Morrison, you told me you only learned about the insurance policy after your son's death. Margaret's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Thomas continued pulling evidence from his box. Here's the contract for the lakefront house, signed 2 days after David's accident. The deposit was due last Friday, which explains the urgent timeline for accessing his insurance money. More documents.
phone records showing Margaret had called David's insurance company multiple times in the weeks before his death, credit reports showing she'd taken out loans against her real estate license using family estate settlement as collateral. And here's my favorite, Thomas said, pulling out a stack of screenshots. Margaret's social media posts from during David's funeral. He spread the photos across the table. Margaret and Robert touring the lakefront house while their son was being buried. Champagne glasses celebrating dreams coming true while we lowered David's casket into the ground. I have a question, Margaret, Thomas said quietly. How does a mother choose house hunting over her child's funeral? Margaret finally found her voice, but what came out was pure venom. David owed us. We put him through medical school, supported his impractical career choices, accepted his marriage to someone who wasn't right for our family. That insurance money is compensation for everything we invested in him. The words hung in the air like toxic smoke. Jennifer's pen was still moving, recording every word of Margaret's confession. So you viewed your son as an investment, and his death as a payout opportunity. We raised him. We sacrificed for him. We have rights. Actually, you don't, Jennifer replied calmly. She pulled out another folder and slid it toward Hartley. I contacted David's insurance company yesterday. They've confirmed that any attempt to fraudulently redirect beneficiary payments constitutes insurance fraud under federal law, punishable up to 20 years in prison and fines up to $1 million. Hartley was frantically reading the insurance company's letter. His face had gone gray. Furthermore, Jennifer continued, conspiracy to commit insurance fraud carries additional penalties, especially when the conspiracy involves fabricated legal documents and attempts to manipulate a grieving beneficiary. She looked directly at Hartley. Mr. Hartley, you might want to consider withdrawing from this representation. Your clients appear to have lied to you about the fundamental facts of this case. Hartley was already packing his briefcase. Mrs. Morrison, Mr. Morrison, I can no longer represent you in this matter. You failed to disclose crucial information about your prior knowledge of the insurance policy and your financial motivations. He left without another word, leaving Margaret and Robert alone at the table with their mountain of incriminating evidence. Here's what's going to happen, Jennifer said, her voice businesslike. The insurance company is flagging your accounts for fraud investigation. The IRS has received copies of your tax evasion evidence. Your real estate contract will fall through when you can't provide the deposit funds, and your current mortgage company will receive notification about the tax liens, which will likely trigger foreclosure proceedings. Margaret's face crumpled as she realized the scope of the disaster she had created. We'll lose everything? You already lost everything, I said quietly. You lost your son's respect, your family's trust, and now you're about to lose your freedom. Robert tried one last desperate plea. Olivia, please, we're family. David wouldn't want us to destroy each other over money. David didn't want you to exploit his death for money either, but that didn't stop you from skipping his funeral to buy a house. Thomas gathered up his evidence, filing everything back into his banker's box. The police will want to interview both of you about the conspiracy charges. I suggest you find new legal representation. As Margaret and Robert left the conference room, their entire scheme collapsed around them. I felt something I hadn't experienced since David died. Not happiness, exactly, but justice. David's legacy was protected. His memory was vindicated. His parents would face consequences for their betrayal. But Margaret thought losing the dream house was the worst consequence she'd face. She had no idea that David's letter contained one more secret, one that would destroy what remained of her reputation and ensure she never worked in real estate again. The final blow was still coming.
The insurance fraud investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Within 2 weeks of our confrontation, federal investigators had frozen Margaret and Robert's bank accounts and seized their financial records. The evidence Thomas and I had provided made the case so clear-cut that prosecutors offered them a plea deal to avoid a lengthy trial. Margaret and Robert each faced $50,000 in fines and restitution payments. Robert's construction license was permanently revoked due to the tax evasion evidence, ending his 40-year career. Margaret lost her real estate license after the fraud conviction, making her unemployable in the only field she'd ever known. But the financial penalties were just the beginning. They were forced to sell their current home to cover legal fees and tax debts, accepting an offer $30,000 below market value because they needed cash immediately. The lakefront dream house they'd tried to buy with David's insurance money sold to another buyer while they sat in court facing fraud charges. Margaret and Robert moved into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a suburb 40 miles from their former social circle. Their retirement dream became a nightmare of financial ruin and legal consequences that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Their friends and neighbors learned about the fraud case through local news coverage. The story had everything that makes gossip irresistible: family betrayal, missing a child's funeral, insurance fraud, and social media evidence of their callousness. Margaret's real estate colleagues were particularly brutal in their judgment. She'd built her reputation on being trustworthy with other people's largest financial transactions. The fraud conviction destroyed that credibility completely. But there was one more revelation I hadn't shared during our confrontation meeting. David's letter contained an additional paragraph I'd kept in reserve, waiting for the right moment to use it. He documented specific instances of his parents' racism toward me, including details of conversations where Margaret had made derogatory comments about David marrying outside his race and Robert's jokes about Asian stereotypes. David had even recorded some of these conversations on his phone, creating audio evidence of their bigotry. When I submitted this evidence as part of the court record, their reputation in their tight-knit community was destroyed completely. Friends who might have forgiven financial desperation couldn't overlook the documented racism. Former neighbors who'd attended backyard barbecues at Margaret and Robert's house learned what they'd really thought about their son's wife. The social exile was swift and absolute. Church friends stopped calling. Golf buddies found excuses to avoid them. Even family members distanced themselves from the scandal. Margaret had spent 30 years building a reputation as a respectable suburban mother and businesswoman. David's recordings revealed her true character, and that revelation followed her everywhere she tried to rebuild her life. Meanwhile, David's insurance money allowed me to honor everything he dreamed of accomplishing. I established the David Morrison Free Clinic in Chicago's South Side, in a neighborhood where most families couldn't afford regular pediatric care. The clinic occupies a renovated community center, with bright murals on the walls and a waiting room designed to feel welcoming rather than clinical. We serve over 500 families annually, providing everything from routine checkups to complex chronic disease management. Many of our patients are kids who remind me of David at that age, curious, resilient, full of dreams they shouldn't have to abandon because of medical bills their families can't afford. I completed my nurse practitioner degree through evening and weekend classes, studying between clinic shifts and administrative meetings. The program took 2 years longer than it should have, but I finished it with a clear sense of purpose that had been missing from my earlier career plans. Now I serve as the clinic's chief medical officer, overseeing a team of physicians, nurses, and social workers who share David's vision of medicine as healing rather than a business. David's legacy grew beyond anything either of us had imagined possible. Medical schools send residents to train at our clinic. Healthcare foundations use our model to establish similar programs in other cities. We've been featured in medical journals and policy publications as an example of community-based care that actually works. My family flew in from California not just to support me through the legal battle, but to help establish the clinic. My father, who'd been skeptical of David's family from the beginning, never once said, "I told you so." Instead, he spent 2 weeks helping us install medical equipment and organize our patient filing systems. "David would be proud of what you've built," he told me during the clinic's opening ceremony. "This is bigger than anything his parents could have stolen." The case became a precedent in Illinois law for protecting surviving spouses from predatory family members. Jennifer has used our legal strategy to help dozens of other widows and widowers defend their inheritances from relatives who view tragedy as financial opportunity. Other attorneys across the country have contacted us for guidance on similar cases.
David's story continues helping families we'll never meet, protecting legacies from people who would exploit grief for personal gain. The transformation in my own life was just as significant. I learned to trust my instincts about people's character in ways I'd never done before. The red flags I'd ignored with Margaret and Robert became lessons in recognizing manipulation and emotional exploitation. I'm stronger now, more protective of my values and David's memory. When people show me who they are through their actions, I believe them immediately. I don't waste time hoping they'll become better people or making excuses for their cruelty. The clinic has also connected me with a community of people who share David's values. The physicians who volunteer their time here, the nurses who work for less money than they could make elsewhere, the social workers who help families navigate complex medical and financial challenges, they're the family I chose, bound together by commitment to something larger than personal comfort. 3 years later, I can think about David without the stabbing pain that used to accompany every memory. I see his face in the children retreat, hear his voice in the conversations about expanding our services, feel his presence in the lives we've been able to save or improve. Margaret thought she could steal his legacy and use it to fund her retirement dreams. Instead, she helped create something far more powerful than she could have destroyed, a living memorial that grows stronger every year. The David Morrison Free Clinic will outlast all of us. Children who receive care there will become doctors themselves someday. Families who maintain their stability because of our services will build better communities. David's vision of medicine as healing rather than business will continue spreading long after everyone involved in its creation is gone. Margaret lost everything she tried to gain and destroyed everything she already had. Her son's memory, her family relationships, her career, her community standing, her financial security, all sacrificed for a lakefront house she never got to buy. Meanwhile, David's real legacy continues growing, one patient at a time, one family at a time, one life at a time. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment. Sometimes it's about building something beautiful from the pieces that selfish people tried to destroy. Margaret spent months planning how to exploit my grief for her financial gain. She never imagined that her betrayal would inspire me to create something that honors David's memory in ways she could never have understood. The woman who skipped her son's funeral because it interfered with house hunting now lives in a cramped apartment, estranged from her community and broke from legal fees. The woman she tried to manipulate runs a clinic that embodies everything her son believed about using privilege to help others. That feels like justice to me.
Looking back 3 years later, I sometimes question whether my response was proportionate to what Margaret and Robert did. They lost everything: their home, their careers, their community standing, their relationships with extended family. They're in their 60s now, living on Social Security alone in that cramped apartment, completely estranged from David's memory and legacy. Did they deserve complete destruction? Or would simply protecting the insurance money have been justice enough? The question keeps me awake some nights, not because I regret what I did, but because I wonder about the line between justice and revenge, especially when you're acting on behalf of someone who can't speak for themselves anymore. Here's what I keep coming back to. Their absence from David's funeral revealed who they really were. But their attempt to steal his insurance money gave me the legal grounds to stop them. Would I have pursued criminal charges if they'd just been absent, but not actively tried to defraud me? I honestly don't know. The truth is, I was seeking justice for David's wishes and punishing them for missing his funeral. Both things were true at the same time. Their callousness at his funeral showed me they were capable of treating his death as a business opportunity. Their fraud attempt proved I was right. But there's a deeper question here about family loyalty and money. Should blood relationships create automatic claims on someone's assets? Margaret genuinely believed that David owed them something for raising him and paying for his education. A lot of families operate under those assumptions, that children's success belongs partially to the parents who invested in creating that success. I think that's wrong, but I understand why people believe it.
The problem comes when parents start viewing their adult children as financial assets rather than independent people with their own dreams and responsibilities. Margaret's racism toward me complicated everything. Was I protecting David's legacy, or was I getting revenge for years of subtle and not so subtle discrimination? Again, probably both. The documented evidence of her bigotry destroyed her reputation more thoroughly than the fraud conviction alone would have. Should I have kept that evidence private? Part of me thinks exposing someone's private prejudices, even when they're disgusting, crosses a line. But another part of me thinks people deserve to know who they're really dealing with, especially when that person has been performing respectability while harboring hatred. The clinic has been healing for me, but I won't pretend it wasn't also a form of revenge. Every patient we help, every family we serve, every life we save, it's all proof that David's money went towards something meaningful instead of funding Margaret's retirement fantasies. There's satisfaction in that beyond just the good we're doing. Was Margaret's financial desperation a mitigating factor? She and Robert were facing bankruptcy, losing their home, watching their retirement security disappear. Desperate people do desperate things, and maybe I should have shown more compassion for their situation. But then I remember that they'd been planning this fraud for months before David died. This wasn't a panicked response to sudden financial crisis. It was a calculated scheme that involved taking out loans against anticipated inheritance money from their son's death. That's not desperation. That's predation. Still, the scope of their downfall sometimes surprises me. I wanted to protect David's insurance money and honor his memory. I didn't necessarily set out to destroy their entire lives, but once the criminal investigation started, it took on its own momentum. The recordings of their racist comments, the evidence of tax evasion, the social media posts celebrating during his funeral, all of it became part of the public record. I could have chosen not to submit some of that evidence, but honestly, I wanted the world to see who they really were. Maybe that makes me vindictive. Maybe it makes me thorough. Maybe both. Here's what I want to ask you, and I want you to be completely honest in the comments. If your in-laws skipped your spouse's funeral to go house hunting, then immediately tried to steal their life insurance money to fund that house purchase, how would you respond? Would you take what people call the high road, just refuse their demands and move on with your life? Or would you fight back with everything you had, using every piece of evidence you could find to expose their true character? And here's the harder question. When you're protecting someone's legacy after they're gone, where exactly is the line between justice and revenge? David couldn't speak for himself anymore. I had to make decisions about how far to go in defending his memory and his wishes. Did I honor what David would have wanted, or did I use his death as an excuse to settle old scores with people who never accepted me as part of their family? I've thought about this every day for 3 years, and I still don't have a clear answer. What I do know is this. The clinic serves kids whose families can't afford healthcare. Margaret's dream house would have served only Margaret. David's insurance money is saving lives instead of funding a retirement lifestyle built on exploitation of grief. There's satisfaction in that beyond just the good we're doing. Was Margaret's financial desperation a mitigating factor? She and Robert were facing bankruptcy, losing their home, watching their retirement security disappear. Desperate people do desperate things, and maybe I should have shown more compassion for their situation. But then I remember that they'd been planning this fraud for months before David died. This wasn't a panicked response to sudden financial crisis. It was a calculated scheme that involved taking out loans against anticipated inheritance money from their son's death. That's not desperation, that's predation. Still, the scope of their downfall sometimes surprises me. I wanted to protect David's insurance money and honor his memory. I didn't necessarily set out to destroy their entire lives, but once the criminal investigation started, it took on its own momentum. The The recordings of their racist comments, the evidence of tax evasion, the social media posts celebrating during his funeral, all of it became part of the public record. I could have chosen not to submit some of that evidence, but honestly, I wanted the world to see who they really were. Maybe that makes me vindictive. Maybe it makes me thorough. Maybe both. Here's what I want to ask you, and I want you to be completely honest in the comments. If your in-laws skipped your spouse's funeral to go house hunting, then immediately tried to steal their life insurance money to fund that house purchase, how would you respond? Would you take what people called the high road? Just refuse their demands and move on with your life? Or would you fight back with everything you had, using every piece of evidence you could find to expose their true character? And here's the harder question. When you're protecting someone's legacy after they're gone, where exactly is the line between justice and revenge? David couldn't speak for himself anymore. I had to make decisions about how far to go in defending his memory and his wishes. Did I honor what David would have wanted? Or did I use his death as an excuse to settle old scores with people who never accepted me as part of their family? I've thought about this every day for 3 years, and I still don't have a clear answer. What I do know is this. The clinic serves kids whose families can't afford healthcare. Margaret's dream house would have served only Margaret. David's insurance money is saving lives instead of funding a retirement lifestyle built on exploitation of grief. But then I also know that part of what drove me was anger, not just at their greed, but at years of subtle racism, at being treated like an outsider in David's family, at watching them dismiss his dreams as charity work while expecting to profit from his death. Was that anger justified? Was acting on it proportionate? Did Margaret and Robert deserve social exile and financial ruin, or just legal consequences for their fraud? These aren't rhetorical questions. I genuinely want to know what you think, because I'm still wrestling with the ethics of what I did. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to defend a loved one's legacy from predatory family members? How did you handle it? Where would you draw the line between protection and revenge? And if you think I went too far or not far enough, explain why. I read every comment, and after 3 years of running David's clinic, I'm still learning about the difference between justice and vengeance. Because sometimes the people who claim to love someone the most are the ones most willing to exploit that love for personal gain. And sometimes the only way to protect what matters is to destroy the people trying to take it. But that doesn't mean it's easy to live with afterward.